this was motivated by two things. Some interesting work I did early on in the career where I got a real surprise about the regularity I'm going to talk about, but also the challenge of we as individuals, as people, how do we comprehend the complexity of the society we live in? It's like, how does the ant have any idea what an anthill is all about? It's just, you know, are we just going through the motions and it happens? Or is there are there some simple global patterns that we can use to comprehend what it is we're a part of? And this is like the tip of the iceberg. There are patterns within patterns. But when you think about it, you know, 300 million people in the United States and 8 billion in the world, it's extraordinarily complex, everyone living their lives. Is there any order in this chaos? And that's what I'm trying to convey today and give you a feeling about how the discovery of order allows us to understand the deviations from that order, as well as a little sense of where we're headed in the future, or the kinds of things that might shape the future. So anyhow, so as we all know that most people in the world live in urban environments, and those urban environments are knit together in a lot of ways, but they're somewhat isolated from nature. And that means that the patterns in which we share are inherently complex. And yet, here's how the flow of this talk goes. I'm first going to introduce a simple pattern, just for the sake of showing you there's a pattern, give you an explanation of sort of how it's displayed, then back up a little bit and try to explain a little bit how that pattern arises. And then given that pattern and what you would expect with a system of cities and places that are integrated, how do you interpret the deviations from that pattern in other parts of the world? And then roll all this stuff forward to the present and see what the patterns, how they're evolving, and the kinds of forces that are shaping them and where it might go. This was the thing that surprised me the most. You may be familiar, now I'm sure there are multiple audiences here. Some of you will eat logarithms for breakfast, they're very simple, and some of them, that's the kind of thing you saw in high school, and that's the end of it. So let me just introduce you to these two axes. The first one is just the population, not of just a city, but actually the urban complex. That is, all the places affiliated with a city that are really a part of that urban agglomeration. It's called urbanized areas in the United States. It has other names around the world, but that's the way the data is represented. So New York City has about 7 million people, but the metropolitan area, well, the urbanized area is like 18 million people. So on the vertical axis is a scale of sizes of places, and at the top is at about 10 to the 7th, about 10 million, or on the 10 million scale, you can see that there are 7 factors of 10 going down from 18 million people down near the bottom of the scale. Is the smallest places that I was counting were 2 people farms. So you have 7 orders of magnitude. Each time you go up a step on that scale, you're going 10 times larger city. Now, the other scale is a little bit more complicated, but not much. The idea is simple. You take the largest city that you're in this conglomerate that you're looking at, and you put it as rank 1. You take the next largest and you put it at rank 2, and the next largest at rank 3. And you just rank order all these urban areas, cities, places, down to family farms on the horizontal axis as rank. And you can see that, again, the scale goes 10, 100,000, all the way up to a little over 1 million. So it's comparable to the largest, the total number of places to count is comparable to the size of New York City, the population. And when you plot the data this way, the remarkable thing is that the pattern of cities and places forms a straight line. And when I plotted this on large paper, I could hardly see the deviation of the dots from the straight line. I mean, you have to use statistical tools to see the deviations. So that was the mind-blowing part of it is, oh my gosh, all of this complexity can be represented by, at least through one window, through this simple pattern. And because the Census Bureau and the human geographers don't really count below places of 1,000, I had to take the total population that was rural below 1,000 population and then match that up to the integral, which is the only place calculus comes in, of the tail end of that distribution, and it matched perfectly. So that's how I could extrapolate down to a 2-family farm with a straight face. And okay. Now the next one is interesting, this is the evolution of the United States. From the very first census in 1790 all the way through the census in 1930, on this plot, you see that the system of cities in the United States, beginning with the colonies and all the way through our evolution, followed that pattern. The only thing that happened is that everything grew. And so the increase in total population and total extent of the network is represented by the lines going higher and higher and higher on the graph, representing more population and larger numbers of places. But nonetheless, they still followed that same pattern. And in a moment, I'll give a little bit of a clue as to why that might have happened. But that's sort of our remarkable history. Now, I'm going to try to explain how these patterns arise. There are really two main principal ideas. One is that when you go from one level of, in other words, there's a hierarchy of cities and places. We're all familiar with this. In other words, if you're living in an intermediate-sized town, you know where the next biggest town is, and when you're in that town, you sort of know where the next really larger town is, and so forth. And here is a map of western Iowa with a regional center around Council Bluffs and Omaha. And this pattern represents the travel that people do in order to get to a hospital. So what you can see is that the dominant center is Omaha, Council Bluffs, but there are these satellite centers, there happen to be 3 of them, where there are also hospitals. And if you go down the scale to things like going to see a lawyer or going to the grocery and so on, people won't travel as far, they'll travel to something close to them. And so that each of the kind of activities that draw people to a center have different reaches as you go up the hierarchy. If I had shown the pattern for newspapers, the newspaper in Omaha would cover this area, and then there would be lines coming in from the outside. At the next level, it's not even shown. So newspapers are a higher level economic function. And that's one of the reasons that the United States grew so regularly over its history, is that New York City became the hub of information, and that the news was collected in New York City, and then it would be distributed throughout the country through packet ships that would run up and down the coastline and other kinds of mail and transportation means. And that network of information was one way that it tied everything together. So the point of this chart is that as you go up a level of complexity, you're actually, what shall I say, each higher central place has typically 3 subordinate places. So there's a branching ratio of 3 going up this hierarchy. And that's common all the way from the top to the bottom of the hierarchy. And if you ever notice when you look at a map, if you don't have a scale of miles, you're not sure, and it's an unfamiliar place, you don't know if this thing is tens of miles or hundreds of miles or whatever. And that is a hint that says all of these patterns are scale invariant, meaning they look the same at every different scale, and you have to actually have the scale defined for you before you know what you're looking at. Now, there's something else going on, and that is the economic multipliers that accrue to the more central places. So a larger place actually has a great deal more economic diversity. There are activities at that central place, like hospitals, that can't exist in your local town, that has a grocery store. And so the human geographers would actually count those number of distinct activities. For example, a gas station is an economic activity. New York City might have 1,000 gas stations in it, but it's one economic activity. And that's what they're talking about. It's like distinct channels through which money can flow. And typically, there's about 24 different business types the way they were counted in this research as you go from one level to another. And that seems to be invariant going up to scale. Now, there's a little stagger in that plot because I'm looking at a specific rural area, more or less rural region in the United States where all of this is laid out. If you had to do it in a more dense and urbanized zone, it would be slightly shifted. But as it turns out, across the whole entire United States, there are about this factor of 24 seems to be the magic number. And so as you have more economic activities, you have a wealth of people traveling in to participate in that activity, as well as all the other lower level activities that are provided locally. And so you have a multiplier in the size of the population you can support in that central city. And lo and behold, that multiplier tends to be around 3 for the United States. So let me go to the next chart. And what I've done, just to sort of spell it out in detail, is to show that as the branching ratio, on the branching ratios at the top level, in this example, you have a largest place, and then you have 3 more secondary places, 9 below that, and 27 with that branching ratio going down. But on the other side, the economic multiplier, I'm just sort of taking a unit of 20 or so economic activities at the bottom, and then each time you go up the ladder, you get 3 more. So it's just a flip by level of what you saw for branching ratio. Now, the only other little twist here is that when you make these plots, you're actually plotting rank. So what you're plotting is the sum of all of those branching ratios going down the chart. Because if you have a leading city and then you have 3 more subordinate, they're a rank 4, and then if you have 9 more subordinate, that's rank 13, and it just keeps on going down. So if you plot that on an ordinary plot, which is rank of place, here I'm only going from 1 to 400, so it's not too daunting. But you can see that even then, on the rank of, where is it? 364 on the lower scale right-hand side is hugging the axis. And then as you get to the larger places, all of a sudden the population takes off, and you wouldn't recognize much of any pattern if you were just shown that sort of plot. And a lot of newspaper articles will show you economic data that's plotted more or less with standard axes, and you can see this characteristic curve. And if you studied this kind of stuff, you realize that underneath it there's a real simple pattern which doesn't pop out the way it's typically plotted. But if you plot this on log-log paper, or in other words, you use a logarithmic scale where factors are equal, in other words, a factor of 3 is the same increment along the scale no matter where the factor of 3 occurs. Voila, you get this simple pattern. It just pops out at you. And so this is usually referred to as scaling, and it harks back to that idea of what scale you look at the map. You really don't know what scale you're working at because all the scales look the same as you go up and down this progression. And this is typical of almost all of the networks that form that we depend upon in our lives. And I'll get to that one in a moment. Okay, next slide. So in other words, if we look at transportation networks, numbers of miles traveled to each of these central places, numbers of miles traveled by individuals in the United States, it spans, many orders of magnitude, but it's a perfect Pareto distribution. It's a scaling distribution. Telephone calls, these patterns are just as precise a scaling pattern as it was for city sizes. The internet and the structure of the internet, the traffic on the internet between URLs, same story. Numbers of employees by business, same story. And even, I wanted to mention, I think I had, even news distribution, that is how information gets around. All of these patterns are networks that have a hierarchy embedded in them. And when you look at the amount of traffic versus the level in the hierarchy that a node might fall at, they form scaling relationships. In each case, you can argue in detail why that takes place for this particular example, but universally it pops up over and over again, even in libraries and word frequencies, and almost every rock you lift, you find these kinds of scaling patterns. There are other names for it. The human geographers have a sort of a strange way of plotting it, which is the one I showed you begin with the population on the vertical scale and the rank on the horizontal scale. But that's a rank size distribution, but it's also known as a Pareto distribution or an inverse power law and a few others. And on those, they usually put the rank, which is kind of a probability of seeing the place, on the vertical scale and the size on the horizontal scale. So don't let that throw you. It's the same animal. It's just the way in which that particular discipline talks about it. Now I'd like to do a little bit of comparison among places in the world to get an idea of how this works. This is Western Europe. It's basically the EU countries. There are about 320 million people in this graph, and that's all of the European countries that are in the EU, and you see how they follow this nice, neat pattern over on the right-hand side. But if you look at France as a subset of Europe, you see Paris is way up at the top as a leading city, and then you drop way down by about a factor of 5, and then the hinterlands in France form another Pareto distribution. So in other words, locally, it's an integrated system, but its leading city is actually a city of Europe. It's not a city of France, per se. And the same thing you can say about London. London is right up there, almost the same as France, which is rather unusual. And you'd think that it would be unstable. And I think politics have shown that that may be the case, that there's a competition that really hasn't sorted itself out. But the hinterlands in Britain wander all over the place. In other words, they really don't follow a very neat pattern of that rank size distribution. They kind of dip down and they bump up and so forth. And if you know Britain, it's a patchwork of dialects of different kinds of centers. Transportation isn't that easy. The distances are awkward to get to. There's a lot of countryside in between. It really hasn't gelled in some sense of the word. And you can see that from the city size distribution. Now, another thing to point out is you notice that the overall exponent, that is the slope of that line, for Europe as a whole is 0.71, meaning it's a lot flatter than what it was for the United States, which was almost unity, it was almost 1. And so that says that there are more little places per big place. And when you think of 330 million or 20 million Europeans, and the largest city they have is 8 million, and then you think of like 200, well, what is it? Let me just check my numbers for 1 second so I'm not completely misleading you. Yeah, in the same time period, in 1970, when that plot was done, the USA was 200 million people, and our largest city was 18 million. So you can just see how much more concentrated the United States was than what Europe is and remains to this day. Okay. Now, if you look at a country like Argentina, and you see that it follows pretty much the rank size distribution for the modest sized places, but lo and behold, Buenos Aires is way up there. This is the pattern we saw for France. So lo and behold, Buenos Aires is more of a city of the world than it is just a city of Argentina per se. And you can sort of understand the nature of the country from that. And go to the next one. Now let's do the flip side. This was the old Soviet Union. And you can see Moscow and Leningrad are two leading cities. And then there are about 10 different cities that are about the same size. And then you see this integrated pattern appear again. Well, those 10 cities, when I lifted the hood and looked, they were the capitals of the republics. So the Soviet Union was not held together by economic integration. It was held together by a gunpoint, and it was held together by coercion. And it really shows up obviously when you just plot the data. And at the far end, you can see that at a scale of, boy, my eyesight, I have to read the chart here. Well, let's see, 10, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, somewhere about 500,000 to 1 million places, you see it take a nosedive. That's what an exponential fall off looks like on this plot. So in other words, you don't have automobiles. They weren't that prevalent in the countryside. So you didn't drive out to a family farm. You lived in a community, and they went out and did agriculture, sort of commuting from their local town rather than living on the farm, so to speak, as we do in the United States. Now, this is Japan, and when I first plotted it, it had all these wiggles in it. So I lifted the hood again, and I looked at the individual prefectures that make up Japan as a whole. And the most urbanized of those prefectures has a slope of 1.18. I mean, it's much more concentrated than the United States. This is led by Tokyo and its surrounds, and then the urbanized hinterlands. But the least urbanized areas, which sort of are beyond a break point in the curve, their concentration is only 0.5. I mean, this is really almost flat. And you can start to understand that the rocky terrain and accessibility issues in Japan mean that you can have people living on the coastline diving for oysters and living almost in medieval times in a culture that's long gone, coexisting with people that are living in probably the most urbanized area in the entire world. Now, this is Australia in 1921. And it's kind of interesting because if you just look at it, you'd say, well, same story, but it's not. For one thing, I've plotted the rank on the vertical axis and the size on the horizontal axis. And the horizontal axis is actually a linear scale now. It's not a logarithmic scale anymore. So this is an exponential fall off. And there's a little, happened to be a physicist. You take statistical mechanics and you believe that everything in the world is exponential, because if you have a system in which energy is conserved and there are all these densities of state, the population in a thermodynamic equilibrium among the different levels of energy falls off exponentially. And so you expect to see exponentials. And that you can flip that argument around and understand what's happening in Australia, which is the thing that's conserved is population. And then there you say, all right, what's the most likely distribution with conserved population distributed among a bunch of places? Voila, that's what you get. And when you read about Australia, especially in the early days, the distances are immense between locations. You have to take long boat rides along the shoreline. And so migration from one place to another is dominating economic activity integration in Australia. Do you have any questions? Did I make that clear? Okay. So let's hop to the present day. Now it gets a little dicey. This is the plot of the city size distribution of the United States today using tools that are analogous to the urbanized area definition. Not exactly the same, but as best I could read, they were quite comparable. And it really makes a difference how you define this, because you can end up going all over the place if you're careless. The line, the solid line, is the same line that you had on that plot that I showed you in 1970. New York City complex hasn't really changed much at all. But you can see that most of the growth in the urban systems around the country have taken place in these distinct regions. In other words, like Houston or Atlanta or some of the western cities. There's a regionality developing in the United States, somewhat mimicking what the Soviet Union had. And we no longer are an integrated system per se. And this may be part of what's showing up in our politics, because we may not be speaking the same interdependent economic and news language, or our cultures may be fragmenting slightly because we're tied to different locally integrated hierarchies that don't maybe interact as much with their neighboring hierarchies. And so this is something that I just discovered when I was putting this talk together. So I'm just making up possibilities. So I really don't have the evidence for any of this. But it all of a sudden says, whoa, there's a lot more to be learned. The same thing, if I take the red line which is sort of an eyeball fit to the tail end of that distribution, it would say that the local hierarchies are getting a little more concentrated. In other words, locally, people experience a more urbanized system than we had, but there are more of these centers proliferating. But I don't have enough data in the tail to really sort this out for sure, so that's just a...
In other words, suburbs?
Well, what happens, all right, urbanized areas do not grow by just population moving in. What happens is they sprawl and they absorb their suburbs. So the suburbs are already absorbed in this representation. Like New York with 18 million people, you know, spreads out into New Jersey and up into Long Island and all over, as long as there's a contiguous pattern of economic development without big gaps in it. And so as these urban areas sprawl, they absorb everything around them. And when you look at the data for Tokyo, which is the largest city in the world, it's not just Tokyo, it's Tokyo and everything up and down the coast near it. So the suburbs are typically part of the city itself, but it's the places just a little bit beyond that.
So Walton had the concept, Walmart, right?
Yeah.
Had the concept of identifying a very rural area between 6 and 7.
Yes.
And then dropping
Absolutely.
10 different
Yes.
economic activities into one building.
Yes.
And how did this, I mean, that was a...
Yeah, exactly. In fact, you hit it. McDonald's, I think if you've seen the movie about McDonald's, there was a pivotal point in the movie where the guy says, "You're not in the burger business, you're in the real estate business." And he was leasing his properties. And the fact is McDonald's and Walmart and all these retailers study this economic geography inside and out. I mean, they are masters at it. I'm giving you a flavor of what's to be learned. But, there's, for example, in downtown Chicago, if you look at a key intersection where there's a lot of commerce and a lot of traffic, the value of the real estate goes up with a Pareto distribution. It just spikes right at these nodes. The same thing we're witnessing in Reston, that the development around the subway station is just huge. You go half a mile away, they can't rent their properties. And this is the kind of shift that is shaping all of this. And so if you're going to be...
What about like the Dollar General? Is that a completely different model?
I don't, again, what had happened is the economic geography was a nice, well-behaved subject up until maybe 1980. And all of a sudden, the South developed and things just exploded. And the field almost collapsed. And then after that, Paul Krugman wrote a paper to explain why businesses were relocating and so on and so forth, and he gets the Nobel Prize. So he resuscitated the field. And then later on, big data comes along, and now we're in the AI world, and each of these guys are parsing exactly your questions for big dollar corporations. Anyhow, I want to, you get an idea that I'm giving you the tip of the iceberg here. I'm just saying that it's doable. Yeah, Paul? Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, maybe Dollar Store uses a different strategy than Walmart or some of the other big retail outlets. And there are classic stories that when the interstate highway system was developed, it wiped out the mom and pop motels and Holiday Inn and McDonald's and Walmart and all those sorts of guys just sort of moved in. Let me see if I'm... Yeah, so that was my next point, interstate highways. Because there are a lot of things going on simultaneously that change the cost structure of locating in different places. The same thing with air conditioning. There was a huge revolution when you could all of a sudden move businesses to the south. Telecommunications became less expensive and more diverse, so you could communicate rather than travel and coordinate. And then now we have the internet and new media, and who knows where we're headed, because all of these things shape the landscape that we can live in. And so college towns are boom towns largely because people like the amenities and they can hook up to the internet and connect to whatever business they happen to be in. But there are still some Rust Belt cities that have just sort of died because their major employer went away. And so we have all sorts of turbulence. Yes?
I just want a clarification of this.
Yes.
Slide. Are you saying that the blue line, it doesn't have any dots on
Yes.
it, is what we would expect as of 30 years ago, and the red line is the reality?
The blue line is what we saw in 1970,
Okay, so, and the red line is
and
now.
the red line is now.
So that means that the lower ranked cities are performing better? They're bigger than we expect them to be?
No, what it is we have, instead of one integrated system with one leading city and a bunch of hinterlands, we have a bunch of little leading cities that are more regional, and they integrate into their hinterlands. And so you have all these hierarchies sort of nested together and lumped in one chart, and that's what it looks like, because you remember seeing the Soviet Union and all of its republics. So we're moving in that direction. We're less integrated as a system of economic and information and transportation connections, and that may say that it's harder to be pluralistic. It's maybe harder to speak with one voice and think with one mind. I don't know. Paul?
Well, I'm trying to
I-
apply this to the area in which we live. So somewhere along the line is, we'll call it Greater DC, for lack of a better term.
Yes.
And so there were, if I understood you correctly, there would have been a Greater DC and then there would have been 3 satellite areas of activity.
Well, actually, Greater DC absorbs all of this, the Virginia suburbs and the Maryland suburbs and everything that is of urban density centered on the District of Columbia is one entity. That would be one dot, one point on this chart.
Understand?
Yeah.
But I thought you also said that there was some sort of economic integration to a center of economic. And I think you talked about Chicago and you talked about
Yes.
New York. Well, my question was, what happens, let's say our area, what happens when the center of economic activity implodes? And what's really happening is that the center of economic activity is moving out to the periphery.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Detroit. It's farmland in the middle of Detroit. I mean, it's a ring. It's still, the urban density is a ring. It's kind of weird. And I really don't know how it's going to reshape things. And there are so many forces afoot, which I'm going to try to get into, that it's not really clear how it's going to evolve. And yeah, there are satellite cities. If you look at the map, you can sort of see what the satellite cities are for DC, but they're way off there. I mean, Richmond is probably, part of it. Jane?
Yeah, well, if you talk about the DC area, it's 3 states, so you have a problem with each state metro. Who's going to fund it?
Yeah, one of the other tasks I had was to look at the net energy analysis of the metro system when it was being built. And clearly it was managed by the Council of Governments, which is this loose affiliation of all those political zones that are benefiting by and contributing to the metro system. And it makes for a mess. I mean, there are all sorts of political distortions. I mean, The engineers worked out where you would put subway stations optimally, and then the politicians came along and said, well, this buddy, I know he wants it in that building, and that's where it went. So there are gazillion forces that were afoot at that time. The thing is, if you look back, in that original study, if I look back to when the central cities no longer could convince the satellite suburbs to join into a unified urban district, and that was around 1910. About 1910, the suburbs tended to maintain their political autonomy. And we've had this difficulty of a patchwork of suburbs trying to play the game, sometimes against the city, sometimes with the city, sometimes against their neighboring suburb, and so forth. And so you had very prosperous suburbs in Detroit, and you had some that were just falling off the map from poverty. It's just now, if you go to Toronto, they have a unified planning district, and they have a green belt, and everything is laid out, and everyone is on the same sheet of music, and they have unified planning, and it's an entirely different environment. They can maintain ethnic identities of communities and so forth. So I think we're a little screwed up, but that's my own opinion. We could do it better, but that's what we have, and you can see it everywhere. I mean, even going down where we live on one side of Sunrise Valley versus the other side, the corridor for the subway has extra taxes on it to pay for the subway corridor, for the subway traffic, because of the amenity that they benefit from. So on one side you have open land and a golf course, and then there's a wall of apartment buildings on the other side. And this happens all over the United States. Let me move it up to the next level, and then we can have a good conversation afterward for whoever wants to hang around. If I then went out and took the same people that used the same tools and plotted cities worldwide, lo and behold, you're starting to see the same pattern again. And the largest city in the world is the greater metropolitan area of Tokyo. And you know, they're probably leading the world and teaching us how to be an urbanized area, if you want to do that. But then you see that there are all these 13 sort of regional entities, and I just wanted to, if you can, maybe the print's a little small, but it starts out with Japan, Indonesia, India has 3 cities in this group, China has 2, the Philippines, Korea, Egypt, Mexico, Brazil, United States. What this is saying is that all of these regional interests have their own little systems of cities underneath them, and we are a collection of regions. We really are not globalized in any kind of economic integration. Now, I took the population sort of that's in that chart and said, what would be the largest city if the world were integrated? Well, the number came out to be 400 million, which is a tad large, maybe. I mean, in terms of taxing the resources of nature and so on, to have that many people in one conglomeration. So something different's going to happen, I think, as we continue into the future. So I wanted now to explore some of the forces that are shaping what this pattern is going to look like and how we can conceive of it, and how the organizations that conceive of it might shape where we're going. And that is this last slide. First, the discipline of economic geography has to do a tap dance. It has to continue to evolve because things are changing right out from underneath it. And technology is one of the big drivers of that. And then I mentioned that Paul Krugman managed to develop a model for the economics of regionalization. And And then the other thing is when you change the discipline, you also change the definitions of what urban areas are. And some places are urban because they're like Tokyo, because they have all this economic vitality and lots of things going on. And some are become urban because a lot of folk came off the countryside because they can't make a living, and they're essentially one extended slum. So you have all sorts of different models happening. The one thing I might argue for the United States is I think we're losing economic diversity. In other words, if we had more economic diversity, we might have a more integrated system, because the larger places might have been able to continue to attract, multipliers to keep themselves going up that pyramid. And one of the things that almost made me weep is when we had these NAFTA and other kinds of international trade agreements, because the economists essentially said, well, let everybody specialize in doing what they do best. And then, so we'll do what we do best and you do what you do best. And what happened is we handed off a lot of economic functions to other places. And what they didn't realize is when you hand off that function, you hand off all the learning that goes with it. In other words, the guy who makes the most widgets is the guy who learns how to make widgets. And there's a thing called the technological progress function. And you can see, for example, the classic example is the performance of jet engines. And it follows a perfect learning curve relative to how many jet engines are manufactured. And so if you're handing off low-level manufacturing to China, let's say, and they just make lots of widgets and make cars and so forth, they're on that learning curve, and pretty soon they'll eat your lunch. So I'm not saying we try to dominate the world. I'm just saying we shouldn't get out of these games. We should have some kind of balanced policy where we maintain a skill base and a connection to the activities that are essential to our economy, and have a more balanced relationship to the rest of the world. So it's like a tariff protection at the very low end, where you prevent being completely wedged out of the industry, but then beyond that you let the world compete. So that's a thought of mine, but it's the kind of thing that I think we need to be putting into the equation. The other big factor is our damage to the atmosphere and our damage to the ecology and our damage in general is because human beings have learned to live with an open-ended consumption cycle. We take resources from nature, we do what we need to do with them, and then we walk away from them. And sometimes it's an abandoned building in a city, sometimes it's trash that goes into a waste system of some sort, or doesn't, or sometimes it's just putting the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so in all of these cases, we have now become the largest geological force on the globe, and we're reshaping our world largely because we don't have any mechanism to take responsibility for the stuff that we use and we need and put it back into the system. We're running open loop. And this means we really have to reorganize the way we live. Otherwise, it's not going to be good. I mean, it just is unsustainable. So then I asked the question, how do we learn how to go about doing this? And two things are a bit disturbing. What I originally showed you were in the days of hand data collection, manual data collection. You go over to the Department of Commerce and they have a room full of human geographers crunching the numbers for all these countries. And now it's all automated. It's all satellite data being processed and, in sophisticated means and what have you, and online records and capturing all the data about how we live and so forth. So there's a ton of data that people can get access to see how they're doing relative to everybody else and how the pieces are going together in making the assumption that the rest of it holds still. But if you then up the ante and you use something like AI to detect patterns and to teach you more about what's happening, you run into two rubs. One is many of the AI systems can tell you there's a pattern here, but it has no, it can't tell you why there's a pattern there. And it doesn't have the tools to open the hood and say why these patterns appear, so you have to come up with some other way of finding that out. The second thing is the data that you're feeding it is based on the past. It's the way we've been doing business. And if we lock ourselves into learning from the past and doing better at what we did in the past, guess what? We're going to do the same thing to our own peril. And so we have to have the vision of seeing that the world could be organized otherwise, and yet our data is saying we have no understanding of what that's going to be. And every player in this game, whether it's a nation state, a political leader, whatever, has to play to the perceptions of the public, otherwise they're gone. And so unless we can shift public perceptions about where we're going and what we're about and what the good life looks like, how do we fight back against just the competitive forces that are trying desperately to win at the game that we've already set up? And that game is sending us into the pit, into the black hole. And that's basically what I wanted to share today. Now, Jane.
Are there any organizations that are using the data in a proactive way that watches and follow, see what's happening?
Well,
Repeat the question.
yeah, are there any organizations that are trying to do this kind of exploration in a proactive way and so forth? And I can't say that I'm plugged into the urban planning community or anything like that actively, but I do monitor what's happening in the sciences that are published in Scientific American or in Science, and they have their fingers in a lot of pies. So when something major comes along, they usually report on it, and I don't see much beyond reporting about how things are and how things need to change, but it's more of the nature of here's what we're doing. It's not in our best interest to keep doing that. We need to change. Here are kinds of changes, but those changes tend to challenge a lot of special interests and the way people make their livings and how they see their future and so forth. So it does not paint an integrated picture of a better world where we could have better lives and still be in balance with nature. So I don't see that being plugged into the planning. I keep looking for it, but it doesn't pop out. Now, I might have missed it. I'm retired and I'm not plugged into the research that much anymore, but I keep looking for it. Any positive thoughts? David.
This isn't exactly a positive thought. For any complex system that can scale to a certain degree, there are diseconomies of scale. How do those show up?
All right. Yeah. Well, David was asking that you do anything that you scale up, keep scaling it up and up and up. You bump into something that it becomes a diseconomy. Somehow it starts to be self-defeating and it's no longer sustainable. And there's a fair amount of research on related topics, and two of them pop to mind. One is back in 1975, there was a study of the how do I say it? The office organizations of major corporations and government and so forth, and showing that in every one of these sectors, the overhead, the office overhead, was growing quadratically relative to the productivity of the underlying activity. And that said, oops, pretty soon it's going to collapse. But lo and behold, the PC came along, the personal computer, and the information age, and it saved our bacon. I mean, our world wouldn't be here if we didn't have computers, and we literally could not go back to without, because our economy would just collapse. So far, we've been able to pile on these innovations to be able to put off coming to grips with the real limits. Now, there's a nasty story, and all right, I'll try to explain this. Some things scale, as urban areas get larger and larger, some things scale slower than the growth of the urban area. But one of the things that tends to go faster is the number of patents and innovation that is generated. In other words, as urban areas get larger, the numbers of patents and new ideas and new technologies that are produced is going faster than the urban growth. And what that means is life is speeding up, because change and coping with all these constraints, we're piling on more and more patches to be able to cope with the constraints. And unfortunately, the math says that this explosive pattern doesn't go on forever. It actually comes to a pole, a divergence in finite time. And there are articles that showed that every time the United States came to a crisis where the technology of today didn't solve the problems that they had created, we came up with an innovation that solved it. And so that urban areas would go boom, they'd burst, and then they'd flatten, and they'd jump, and they'd flatten, and they'd jump. We've gone through multiple cycles of this. So we've been running away from those constraints for some time. But, you know, when you think of the kind of competition that we have globally with crazy people that want to dominate the world and so on, and trying to keep populations happy, I mean, it's hard to sleep at night, I'm sorry. So, yes, David.
Coming back to Paul's question.
Okay.
Could you bring this to the local scale and tell us what you foresee the rest of?
Well, yeah, I mean, I know what I'd like to say. We are ideal. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. David asked, can we bring what we've learned here today into the local scale and say what kinds of things we might do or how we might look at it or what could be done? And Jane and I happen to be living near the intersection of Wheelie and Sunrise Valley, which is where there's a node with a subway. So there are huge developments going in there, Campus Commons and a bunch of others, and Comstock developments and what have you. And they deign, when in the 11th hour, to come and have a public hearing to say, you know, what do you think about all this? And I find that there are two things that are an afterthought. The whole idea of getting people out of their cars, this is the rhetoric that they'll give you. The idea of getting people out of their cars is putting them close to a subway stop and to amenities so they can walk and they don't have to drive. And that's great, except for one problem. There's no integrated pedestrian planning. If you look at Wheelie Bridge, there's no pedestrian lane on the east side of the bridge. If you look at trying to get from Reston Station Street up to the plaza where you get on the subway, it's a 2.5-story climb of stairs. I mean, there are a lot of folk that are going to be huffing and puffing doing that. Or else you go down to the end of the block and go back and you have fewer stairs and try to wind around if you know where you're going. I mean, no signs tell you how to get there. There's no navigational aid. So one of them is if you're going to think of pedestrians, well, bake that into the plan in the beginning and make it a part of the constraint that you're going to put on the table. The second thing is, there's a study in this human geographic work that shows that a planned development center, like a planned center like a Tyson's Corner, or Tyson's 1, let's say, or Tyson's 2, if you have a planned center where you lay out in the original architecture the magnet stores and the satellite stores and so on, you can get 5 times the diversity of offerings that you can with a strip mall model of development. You know, whoever comes up with a bright idea moves into the store and opens a shop. For the same, serving the same population, you get this huge multiplier in diversity. And I would ask them at these planning meetings, have you gotten together with the other developers in the area to see what kind of businesses they're putting in and what the symbiosis is among these businesses and where the economies of scale are and all of that? And I get these blank stares. So the point is, I think in principle we know how to do better, but the entrepreneurial model we have is more like strip development. Whoever owns the property does whatever they want to with it, as long as it meets some minimal planning criteria. And I find that we're missing an opportunity. So the answer is to integrate the planning so that it really works means that every one of those developers has to give up a little of their autonomy to what's going on around them. And the people that are making those decisions don't want to give up autonomy. They're more worried about timescales and how they're going to make their budgets work, you know, in building the thing and selling it off to some third party. That's, I'm sorry, you tapped into my cynicism. Yes, David.
And yet, in spite of this,
Yes.
the population around Greater Reston is growing like gangbusters.
Yes.
Could you explain that?
Yeah, what there is,
Say the question.
oh, okay. The question is, why is the population growing gangbusters around Reston and especially in that corridor? Well, the corridor is exceptionally attractive to businesses. And that's what this economic functions thing that I was pointing out is. You add a bunch of economic functions. There are huge multipliers. You pay a salary to someone working in Google, for example, which is in that little wedge-shaped building across the street from us. And that Google employee then spends it locally in the economy, and that gets spent several times in the economy, so you have these economic multiplier effects. So for each export job you create maybe 2 or 3 local jobs. So this thing is just, as long as businesses are deciding to plant their head offices here because it's near Washington, they can lobby, they have access to resources. Loudoun is a computing center that won't quit. All of these things are the leading edge of where the country's going. So we're really a hub for hosting a lot of new businesses and a lot of new activity. And that has a huge multiplier effect. And they're expecting 30,000 more people to move into Reston over the next 10 years or something like that, as this builds out. Yeah.
Yeah, Reston was around 60,000 for a very long time. We're open now.
Well, depends on what you define as Reston. Reston under Reston Association is a little bit bigger, maybe 65, 70. But if you take the corridor, it's, I think that's where that 30,000 was going to go. And the question is, where are the schools going to go? Where are all the amenities, you know, the theaters and all the things that go with the growth of population? And I'm not sure that there's any coordination in playing off, you know, how the theater interacts with the eating, with the whatever. This is where I'm feeling like we may be missing an opportunity. Jane?
Yeah, I just want to announce that a meeting
let me announce that. There's going to be a planning meeting for the stretch of Wheelie Avenue that goes from about Newton Square to Sunrise Valley at Langston Hughes School on the 23rd at 7 o'clock? Yeah.
And I want to just plug,
Yeah.
okay, I got very vociferous on the phone with Walter Alcorn's office, but good person, others came to this meeting and said that we need a crosswalk right here at the church. We need walking paths, poor Angie, if she tries to get me. We got her down to Metro, that's a joke. Across here, where the cuts to the road, and it's, get that out there. We haven't had meetings in the past because of hopefully the mail meetings, so. And we do have some good news. We have organizations that keep the golf course over them, and we do have civic involvement. The younger people in general are not as, they're into their jobs, go home, and go get a glass of wine, but amenities. What? Amenities.
Yeah, and go ahead, David.
I propose, given everyone's schedule, I vote that we thank Bob for a fascinating talk. We got goals.
Oh, boy.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks.